Are you making gains in your training and racing, but you can't exactly tell why or how? Perhaps your FTP isn't going up, but you're outperforming your peers. Or maybe it's the exact opposite. Have you ever wondered what's going on under the hood of your athletic engine? Well, if you have, today's episode will touch on all of that and hopefully explain more of what's going on. Our guest today is Sebastian Weber. Sebastian, where are you joining us from?
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening. I'm joining you from Switzerland today, actually. That's what I call home.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love Switzerland. Spent some time doing the Swiss Epic last year, and man, I like I said, want to try to find a way to get there again, either to ride bikes or explore. So, can you tell our audience a bit more about yourself, Sebastian?
Well, yeah, so I'm what we call in Europe a sports scientist, so you might call it physiologist. I studied sports science and actually also molecular human biology, and I've worked for phew, more than 10 years in professional cycling and more than 20 years in coaching amateurs and recreational athletes. And since 2017, I'm the project leader of a company called Inside, and that's what keeps me busy currently, I would say.
And that's what we're here to talk about today too. But before we get into the software, I want to ask, how did you get into coaching and physiology and working with the athletes that you've worked with, like Tony Martin, Peter Sagan, Jumbo Visma, Highroad? How'd this all start?
Well, so as I said, I studied sports science back in the day. Started at 1999, and in 2000, and then yeah, actually during the studies already, I got asked if I could work in the human performance lab in the University of Cologne, which is actually a university only specialized on sports. It's the biggest one like that in Europe. And
Mhm.
so this is how I started. And then we had professional athletes, professional cyclists coming in to do their health checks and their regular checkups. Um, and this is how I first got in touch with some professional athletes. Um, and so then I finished my studies and got my diploma, or what nowadays you would call a master degree, um, with with some special reward, actually,
Mhm.
for how I've done it. Um, and then I did some research projects, basically research projects on developing a method to um, measure the glycolytic power, or if you want to more broad, the anaerobic power of an athlete, and to
Mhm.
use this information in conjunction with power data. And you have to think about it this way: that in 2002 to 2003, of course, there have been power meters, but they have not been as widely spread as nowadays, right? And so
Right.
my work was then to develop a method to calculate something what today people call FTP, so anaerobic threshold. And it came out that we could calculate it more precisely, much more precisely actually, than any other method, and also understand how it is created. And so to come a little bit more back to your question, um, then this method basically aroused a lot of interest within all the professional cyclists in the area, and also amateur cyclists. And then fast forward 4 years ish, in 2006, basically when the when this Fuentes doping scandal happened, the at
Mhm.
that time T-Mobile team fired Jan Ulrich, and with him all the management of the team. And end of mid to end of 2006, Bob Stapleton from the US took over, and
Mhm.
they wanted a coach or a head coach or a head sports scientist or performance manager, whatever you want to call it. I don't really care. Um, who did have a serious scientific background in physiology and being able to work with power data. Again, at this time, it was not as common as it is today. And
Right.
instead of having a medical background in, helping athletes to increase performing, having a scientific background on it. And so, yeah, you could say a little bit a similar method with what you would now find in Inside. Obviously, it's much more developed. It's like the 3.0 version of what we started using in 2006 in the professional teams. Is actually, so you could say, simplified saying, the Inside software is actually what created so much interest in professional cycling in 2006 that I became, with the age of 28, the head coach, scientist, whatsoever, um, at Team T-Mobile, which then eventually became Team Highroad, HTC, Columbia, and eventually became, I think, still the most, or one of the most professional cycling teams in the history of cycling. And so this is how it started. And then, you work with the professional, with the most successful teams, and yeah, you had guys like Tony Martin, 20 Professional 2008 with us, and then moved on to other teams and worked with guys like Basso or Sagan, or with Highroad with Hinkepie and Greipel. Like started working with Greipel from the very beginning. Um, so yeah, and now the work with Jumbo and other teams, CCC and other athletes, and especially also other sports. So we're
Hmm.
not limited to cycling. People see us from cycling, but actually the first organization that signed up for a license of Insight actually was the French Institute for High Performance Sports, with the French National Swimming Federation. So we're not limited to that anymore. But this basically is how it started, and this is how I ended up working with all those athletes and professional teams.
Yeah, that's a great history of sport physiology there. And yeah, as our audience can hear, I mean, let's call it a physiological sage is who we're interviewing today. So Sebastian, again, welcome to the show and taking time to sit down and talk with us here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into the software. What is the Inside Power Performance software?
Well, I think the name, or I hope at least the name is trying to tell a little bit. Um, Inside is a software which is, as one professor from Spain called it, it's a software which is looking into the body of the athlete, is looking into the muscle of the athlete, um, to find out what's going on inside the athlete when they are exercising, when they are performing. So you said it in the intro a little bit, looking under the hood. So, uh,
That's right.
you know, it's just not satisfying to just say, oh, your power output is ish, your power does X, Y, Z, and or your speed in another sport like swimming or something is whatever X, Y, Z. That's just not satisfying. In order to increase performance, and this is really what it is about, in order to increase performance, you need to understand what are the limiting factors, what is limiting the athlete, and then this is what you want to focus on in training, in the preparation. um, and that's nothing uncommon. That's if you look at any other industry except for cycling, that is normally what people do, right? If you look at business and people
Right.
try to increase the revenue or the profit of the business, they're looking, okay, where can we gain efficiency, where can we save costs, right? That's what you do. When you go to a doctor because you don't feel good, right? Let's imagine you are a cyclist and you have pain in your knee, right? And you go to a doctor, and the doctor says, you know what? Oh, you have got pain in your knee when you ride your bike. You know what? Just ride less and take some ibuprofen and some painkillers. That's not a satisfying answer, right? The satisfying
Right.
answer would be to find out why this is and then fix it. So the question here, when it comes to training, should be, and you know, can bring up the example of an FTP, you can bring up any other example, right? Um,
Hmm.
how is it created? Why is it what it is? In order to answer the question, how can we fix it? So which knob, so to speak, which can we turn here in order to increase our performance? And that's basically the idea of looking inside the athlete, and that's where the name of the software comes from, inside. Um,
Hmm.
you know, Finding out what are the performance limiting factors, and then target those in training instead on just guessing. where you how you want to improve your performance.
Yeah. So it's a true diagnostic look under the hood of the athlete engine, and not only see, say, what is improving in terms of the power duration or a response to the heart rate, but you're starting to see the fuel utilization aspect. And I guess we'll get into that here in just a minute, but it's a truly looking under the hood at the engine and seeing how performance is being generated rather than just, oh, the athlete performed well.
Right, and to make this clear, it is not something, at first sight people sometimes think, oh, this is a substitute for my training peaks or today's plan account or whatsoever. No, it's not. Right, we
Hmm.
don't do any training plans, um, and it's not your substitute for whatever golden sheet or WKO or whatever you use to look at your actual writing data. That's also not what we do, right?
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
you know from a coaching perspective, you could say, something like Training Peaks or Today's Plan or so on is your everyday software, right? This is
Right.
where you put in the workouts and where you maybe communicate a little bit with your athlete because he or she will leave comments to the workouts, right? And then something like Golden
Hmm.
Cheetah or WKO is where you look at the data maybe and look at how the athlete has performed the workouts and so on and so forth. And then Insight is a complementary tool which you basically use to understand, okay, which direction do I want to go in training. I I could quote the I could quote here Marco Pinotti, who's the head of performance at CCC, professional cycling team, right? And he said
Hmm.
insight for him is like the compass that guides him in the dark. So we are not making training programs. We're not looking at every workout, but insight is a software, so to speak. Let's say you plan a training or you want to plan a training, right? You want to sit down and plan the next block of training for the next 2 or 3 months. So you're at this moment, you're making the decision on which direction the athlete should go in terms of training, right? And this is when
That's
this is when you use insight and you decide, okay, should I go either long and easy, short and hard? How do I fuel the athlete? How do I design interval programs? How do I design load versus on versus off phases and intervals? What should I target? More like VO2 max, or should I start target other stuff? These are the questions that is answered by Insight, right? So it's not the
so it's
everyday little tiny stuff. It's giving you the direction where to go.
Yeah. And the best way I think I can describe it, and full disclosure here, I have not been using this with my athletes. I will be. But the best way I can describe it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sebastian, but a software that you can use the protocol of testing in order to gain more insights to develop training strategies for your athlete.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's like
Okay.
for me, if I may use this metaphor here, is a training plan is trying to be the shortest connections between where you are at the moment and where you want to
Hmm.
go in terms of what is your sporting goal, right? Either a
Yep.
race or just increase your fitness, or like you say, you want to ride around Switzerland and do some passes, some climbs in the Alps. So what I'm trying to say here is you might have some idea what is your goal, right? And if when you ask an
Hmm.
athlete or a coach, there's a lot of great feedback in terms of, yeah, I know I need to whatever be able to spare carbohydrates, right? I know I need to be able to increase my fat combustion, or when it comes to road racing, I know I need to be able to recover better in a circuit race. So the athletes and the coaches can tell you where they want to go, or so to speak, what they need to improve. But when it comes to, okay, where are you now, like put a number behind how good you are in terms of recovery, and then becomes very silent in the conversation because nobody normally has this number, right? And
Exactly.
this is the void that insight, so to speak, fills here, right? It is helping you to create this training program much more targeted and much more focused on what you really want to work on. Nothing more, nothing less.
All right, Sebastian. So the three pillars of the power performance decoder, that's probably the better way to describe it. Could you explain to me and our audience what those are?
Right. So that's a little bit a technical question here. When without seeing the software,
For
it's
sure.
maybe
And that's a
yeah,
limitation.
it's maybe not so easy to understand. But let me explain. Let me try to explain it in a way that hopefully resonates very good with your audience. And let me so there are three pillars of the PPD, of the power performance decoder, which is the VO2 max, so the aerobic performance or aerobic power of your athlete, of an athlete. And then there's a VLA max, which is the maximum glycolytic, which is an anaerobic pathway, right? Glycolytic power performance of the athlete, and there's the anaerobic threshold. So these are the three pillars. Okay. And what we mean by three pillars is that in order to use insight in this way, so there are different gatekeepers, so to speak, how you can use insight depending on the sport and how you want to, obtain the data. But let's stick to the power performance decoder. So when you want to use a power performance decoder of insight, you need to have one measurement that allows the software to calculate VO2 max. You need one set of data that allows the software to calculate VLA max, and um, one data set that allows the software to calculate anaerobic threshold. And the way this works, or why it's three pillars, or why it's interconnected, and what also makes it unique and more accurate, is think about, and this is, I think, what will resonate hopefully pretty good here with your audience, is think about the anaerobic threshold. So, in terms of the real scientific way to talk about anaerobic threshold, the maximum lactate steady state. So, the maximum power output an athlete can hold without accumulating lactate,
Right.
right? And what this is when you talk about the maximum lactate steady state, it implies that there's some kind of lactate production going in there, right? Because we talk about the maximum steady state, right? So there's a lactate production happening, right? And then there's
Hmm.
also, when you exercise, there's a lactate combustion happening. And the latter is something everybody knows about, right? When you do hard interval training in between the intervals, instead of sitting in the grass for 10 minutes, you keep pedaling easy because you want to combust the lactate,
Right.
right? Just
Right.
imagine for a second, just put yourself in this situation. You wouldn't do that. You just would lay on the road for 10 minutes. You get up to the next interval. Your legs would feel pretty bad because you didn't combust the
Right.
lactate. So, long story short, your FTP, anaerobic threshold, maximum lactate steady state. I'm not going into the details, splitting hairs, what might be the difference, blah, blah, blah. Forget about it. Doesn't matter
Hmm.
anyway.
Hmm.
So let's say your anaerobic threshold whatsoever is the maximum lactate steady state is created by an equilibrium of lactate production and lactate combustion. Okay. And
Hmm.
this refers to what I just said, the other two pillars. So the VO2 max, the performance, the power, the capacity of your aerobic system determines how much lactate you can combust at a certain power output. And your VLA max, your maximum glycolytic or lactate production ability, so to speak, or capacity, determines how much lactate you're producing. And so these two systems determine what at which power is your anaerobic threshold. And bringing it back to what we said a few minutes ago, this knowledge and this technology is exactly what brought me into the world of professional cycling and aroused so much interest that many athletes and many teams by now are working with that method, because it's explaining you not only, and this is, I think, the very important thing. It is one thing to ask the question, what is my anaerobic threshold, what is my FDP, right? And
Hmm.
it's another
Hmm.
thing to ask, and everybody will have an answer, right? Everybody will tell you, yeah, I know it's
Sure.
whatever, 275 watts, and last week it was 273, so it improved, blah, 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 whatsoever. It's one thing to ask this question. It's another thing to ask the question, okay, why is it 276 watts? And why is it not 376 watts? And what would need to change physiologically in order to improve it? And then again, it becomes very silent. And this is basically what the VO2 max and VLMX are doing for you. They, they explain you how a threshold is created. And this is what, you know, is included in the power performance decoder.
And so, with all that said, would you say that in order to use this software, can any athlete use this software? Can any coach use this software? Or how does it work? Like, if someone listening to this podcast would say, "Well, that sounds really good, Sebastian. I want to." pick the software up and go use it on myself and then do my training. What does the process of that look like?
So at the moment, Insight is only available for coaches, I have to say. So we are only running, on a B2B and a business to business relationship. So Insight currently is not, there's no public facing part of Insight for an athlete. So when you are an athlete, then you want to find a coach who is using Insight. And we have a map on our website so you can look, in your area, is there somebody? And with a PPD, it can be all done remotely. So with a power performance recorder, the testing also works remotely. So you can pick somebody from, I don't know, South Africa or Uruguay
Right.
or Russia if you want to to analyze your data and give you that feedback. We do have an increasing community of coaching using it, coaches, especially in cycling, using it, right? Um, I'm
Hmm.
not excluding, I'm not ruling out the possibility that there might be an athlete version for Insight sometime in the future, but currently, um, currently it's only for coaches. And as a coach, you get your own Insight account, you get your own software, and you always get the training with it. And that's for every coach, right? That can be for a part-time cycling coach who's whatever, a teacher in school, or has a second job, so to speak, and only coaches at
Hmm.
part-time. That also applies. That also applies when you are, for example, the German Swimming Federation, which is using Insight as one example, right? And you have a PhD in physiology. You will always receive the software in combination or in conjunction with the training. And this is because, and this is, where I'm trying to go here is the explanation why it's only inside to coaches and not directly inside to athletes, because the software is offering you so much flexibility in terms of what you can do. We didn't even touch on about performance projections or virtual performances
Right.
or these kind of things, what the software offers you. There are so many knobs, so to speak, you can turn, right? So giving you just one example, when you are swimming, let's say you are a running coach, and you want to find out how much time dropping 1% body fat, how much time it saves you on a half marathon. Insight can calculate the answer for you. So there are many, many things to, like, yeah, it's very versatile basically. And this is why currently it's not in the hands of an athlete. It's no offense against the athlete. It's just that it involves a decent amount of training and education. So we actually do have something what we call the Insight College, where Insight users get trained on the software, on general aspects, on physiology, just to make sure that we create a level field of knowledge, um, for everybody to maximize what they get out of the software. And that's really what it is about. To train people to get to get the maximum out of them using Insight. So sorry for the long answer. When you are a
No,
coach,
it's a wonderful
when
answer.
you are a coach, contact us. We are happy to whatever show you, and you can judge for yourself if you feel like that's something for you or it isn't. That's fine. When you're an athlete, currently, um, you know, on our website, there's find insight on the under the contact form, and you can have a map and see where you can find a coach, and that's currently the way how to do it. And the good thing about it is that most coaches who use Insight don't offer only the Insight testing, they also offer the Insight testing only in conjunction with some kind of consultancy. And maybe let me add this from my experience, because I had my own human performance lab in Germany for many, many years. It's a very common thing that you have athletes who call you up and say, look, I just want to know, I just want to do the testing. I just want to see all my metabolic profile. And then I'm fine when it comes to training. And then actually, when you sit down with the athlete and you explain all these metrics, and there are some new metrics to it, glycolytic power, recovery rate from lactate, these kind of things, right? There are so many new metrics, and
Mhm.
without any offense, actually, right? S- don't get me wrong here, but even the most knowledgeable athletes then come to the point where they say, okay, maybe it would be good to have a sparring partner here to exchange some ideas on how I use this in training, to say the least, or not even for
Well,
getting a training
this is
program.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I asked the question because, and I know we're going a little off script here, but even as I'm getting up to speed on this stuff, and then when you describe the three pillars, for example, I could see somebody listening to this podcast and be like, "Ooh, combustion of lactate. I want to do that better." Right. But there's so many other things going on within the realm of those three aspects that you just discussed in conjunction with the rest of your software that the weekend warrior will not be able to fully maximize the use of the software, and they need somebody to come alongside them in order to get the job done and point them in the right direction. So I think it's actually a really good way, or a really good thing, that you guys do provide the knowledge and resources to educate people on how to use this, because otherwise we'd end up going down the route of uh, FTP and have this whole philosophical discussion on why no one really knows what it is, even though everybody's chasing it, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's
I mean,
that's that's very well said. And I think we should aside, we should put aside any ego here. You know,
sure, yeah,
it is, it's no offense. Like everybody has its, the blank spots in when it comes to physiology and training and so on and so forth. And it's really what
mhm,
you said. We just want to maximize how people can utilize this tool, right? the like
right,
like for me personally, right, I rather have somebody, using it with uh, a, a lower number of athletes, or, so to speak, adopting it slower, right, than missing out on pieces, so just to give
yep,
you an example, like 2 days ago, I talked to, head of performance of a world tour cycling teams. They want to start using Insight, um, and we just agreed on it. That's what we normally do, is that we start only with a fraction of the team and only a fraction of the coaching stuff, right? Because
mhm,
when you start to go from zero to hero, then there's a fair chance that you lose somebody on the way, so to speak, right? And
yep,
that's not the idea, right? That's not our interest. So what we are trying to do is to provide you the most accurate tool possible, the most precise tool possible, and with the most comprehensive training. So going back to the Power Performance Decoder, Power Performance Decoder was in development for 2 years. The official launch date was April 2019, and it wasn't yet. It was good, and if we would have launched it at that time, nobody would maybe have noticed the little glitches or inaccuracies on it or whatsoever. But instead of launching it, we preferred giving the prototypes, giving the beta versions to some professional teams and to some coaches, professionals, non-professionals, so virtual coaches versus commercial coaches, and human performance lab, and that they play around with that, and then with their help, improve it and take almost another year until we launched it, until it had the accuracy and validity and repeatability and all the functionalities that we wanted it to be. And this is kind of the philosophy of the whole company, right? Make things a little bit
right.
slower if needed, but make it correct and make it right.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the approach. I really do. So any athlete can benefit from the software, but let's hone in or zoom in on the cyclist.
Right. Sorry. Yeah.
Can we? Yeah. No, it's all good. Because I love ping ponging around. I think it's very healthy, and I think it's good for the listener as well to understand that there's more than just triathlon or cycling going on here. But can we talk about like a field testing scenario of where we would get the data from, how to plug it in, and what that looks like?
Right. Sure. We need to narrow it down a little bit. So I'm just assuming that you want to talk maybe about power only data capture.
Let's go power only data capture, and let's assume that someone is again field testing with an accurate power meter, uh, cycling computer, and they're pretty savvy and organized with their data using today's plan or Training Peaks or
Right,
something like that.
right. So as I indicated before, inside when it comes to the power performance decoder, lactate testing is very versatile, right? So just giving you
Hmm.
one example protocol how you could do it. So with the cycling and with using only your power meter, so without lactate and without a VO2 analyzer, so the most simple approach, so to speak, that you could do. Um, the standard protocol, so to speak, would consist of 4 efforts, um, which is a 20-second sprint, and it doesn't really matter if it's 18 or 23 or whatever, right? We like the
Hmm.
software takes everything between 14 and 25 seconds. Um, a good sprint is 20 seconds. Um, and I can come back to the details, but so let's first that's one of the efforts, and then it's
Hmm.
3 all-out efforts, and one should be in the ballpark of 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, and then the other one should be about 6 minutes ish. Can be 5, can be 7, doesn't really matter. That's the protocol that we give out, and then the last one is about 10 to 12 minutes, right? So now, when you hear that, you might say, "Okay, well, that's boring. What is he talking about? That's the same thing I'm doing anyway, right? That's the same thing everybody else does." Um, and I get it. I get it. That on the first glance it might look like that. However, how you need to carry out those tests and what we do to the data, especially, is something vastly different. So let me go a little bit into the details here. So the 20-second sprint, whatever it is, let's call it just 20 seconds for the sake of simplicity. The 20
Hmm.
second sprint has to come from rest. So you're not allowed to pedal for the last at least 90 seconds before the effort. And
Are you talking like standing start
well,
or
standing start, I don't
rolling
care.
into
I
it?
don't really care, or it's not important if it's a standing start or if it maybe comes from coasting. So speed is
Hmm.
higher than zero. The
Hmm.
point is, it's not the speed. The point, well, it is the speed, but not the speed of the bike of your bike. It is the speed of your
Hmm.
aerobic metabolism. So what you're trying to do is you try to minimize the influence of your aerobic metabolism before you sprint. You're trying to create an as anaerobic as possible effort. Think about it this way. If you ride along, let's say with 200 watts for 5 minutes, steady power, and 200 watts is maybe whatever, 60, 70% of your FTP. So it's almost entirely covered aerobically, right? So you
Yeah,
ride a ride along,
very moderate.
right? It's moderate intensity. It's covered aerobically, energetically speaking. And now you start to sprint, all out, maximum sprint. Just because you start to sprint, it's not meaning that your aerobic metabolism is adapted to 200 watts. It is producing 200 watts aerobically. And just because you start to sprint, those 200 watts are not going away, right? So let's say you start to
Hmm.
sprint and after 1 second, after 2 seconds, you reach 1000 watts. Then 200 watts at least of this 1000 watts are actually produced aerobically because they have been there before, right? So
Hmm.
it's not
Yep.
fair. It's just not right. It is just not correct to say, yeah, it's 1000-watt anaerobic power just because you think it might be common sense or it applies. It was a sprint effort, so it has to be anaerobic. No, 200 watts of these 1000 watts is anaerobic. So this is if you would do this with the software is actually checking when you run a sprint test in the software, the algorithm is set up in the way that it checks if you have been rested the last 90 seconds before the effort. And if it's not accepting the sprint. So this is how picky we are when it comes to the
Hmm.
data hygiene, so to speak here, right? So
Hmm.
so that's a sprint. So the 20-second effort, the aim is to create a very, very pure anaerobic effort, right?
Yep.
And then we have this 2.5, 3 minute effort all out. And this is what we use to determine the maximum aerobic performance or power output of the athlete, right? So, of course, before the naysayers come in, of course, in a 3 minute effort, there is a significant amount of the power of your 3 minute maximum power output, or a significant amount of the energy is coming from anaerobic sources, right? Of course, right?
Hmm.
You're riding well below above your VO2 max in a 3 minute all out effort. But the story is that because from the anaerobic effort, we know we are able to very accurately calculate your glycolytic, your anaerobic, your VLA max performance or power. And therefore, we are able to distinguish how much of the energy or power in your 3 minute effort is coming from anaerobic slash glycolytic, more precisely, energy sources. And therefore, we can very precisely um, calculate the VO2 max from your 3-minute effort, right?
Yep.
And then the 6 and the 10 minutes effort are just needed in combination with the 3-minute effort to create a very simple power duration curve. And that then is nothing different from WKO or Golden Cheetah or whatsoever, right? I mean, that's what everybody does, right? It's even boring to talk about a power
Hmm.
duration curve. I mean, everyone knows how this works. So this is just we use, so to speak, for the third pillar. Coming back to the pillar, so the 20 seconds is for the pillar of VLA max, glycolytic power. The 3-minute is for the pillar of VO2 max, and then the combination of 3, 6, and 10 minutes is used for the anaerobic threshold estimation or calculation, right? And then we have the third pillar here, right? And this said, if I may allow to add this, you can even substitute it. So the way how the software is set up, you can substitute the 6 and the 10-minute efforts and just go in and say, okay, you know what? I have my modeled FDP from WKO, which is, has a decent accuracy to it. So instead of doing the 6 and 10 minutes, you can just manually type in your modeled FDP from Golden Sheet or WKO, I don't care what, and then run the power performance decoder, right? That's totally fine.
Yeah.
So that comes down that your net testing time is down to 3 minutes and 20 seconds, actually, right?
That's exciting because I was sitting here looking at it and I was like, all right, 20-second sprint, 3-minute effort, got it. Okay, but then a 6-minute all out and a 12-minute. I was like, that's going to be a big day for me. So okay, so you can use some data from other sources, or could you also say, I don't know, could you split this up into 2 days
Yeah,
as
so
well for the
so
testing? Or
so the
okay,
first answer is, yeah, you could use any data source, as I said, right? Inside is just
hmm,
the engine which creates your 360-degree metabolic physiological performance profile, right? When you have been to a
hmm,
lab and you've done a RAM test with VO2 analyzer, just plug it in, right? Just put it in.
got it,
If you have a
got it.
lactate
Yep.
machine with you, measure the lactate, put it in. It digests, so to speak, everything, no matter what you throw at it, so to speak, right? Um,
And the more data, the better, or the more data points, or
well, if
is that a rabbit hole?
well, assuming that the data is legit and robust, yes, right? And
Got it.
this maybe
Yep.
brings us back to the other questions that you have, like, do I have to do it all in one day? No, you don't.
Hmm.
Even forget
Yep.
about all this fancy power stuff and just go back to the lactate version of Insight, which the WorldTour teams are using. They usually or very often don't do it on one day. They also like to spread it out over 2 or 3 days. And that's the same you can do with the power performance decoders. You could do your 20-second sprint, you could do one every day, right? And enter it
Hmm.
3 or 4 times. And this will then, providing or given that all those sprints are good quality and rested and you feel fresh and so on, um, this will then help with the accuracy of the data. And honestly, my personal opinion is, and this is what most of our coaches also from the professional levels are doing, it is actually a very good solution to distribute the efforts over more than one day, over on more than one session, to do it at least over a course of 2 days, maybe even 3. And the reason why I prefer that is because in 95% of the cases, I would say, you want to use the results to make a better informed decision on how you need to train, right? You mainly use the data to make informed decision on your training. Okay. So this said, I think that you should, create the results and create the analysis based on the best possible overview how your metabolism, how your performance is during a training scenario. So I'm giving you the opposite of what especially people in Europe are doing. Sometimes they are like, okay, yeah, I want to have a performance checkup. I go to the lab. um, Before I go to the lab, I need 1 week of unloading, and then I need 2 days of no training, and then I can't have coffee on the day, and I need to have a special meal in order to not mess up the metabolic card readings. So what you're
Hmm.
creating here, you're creating a very artificial testing scenario. So you should ask yourself, how much is that representative to what happens in training? So therefore, I really appreciate when you do whatever it is, power performance equal lactate testing, doesn't matter. When you do it out of training with your coffee, with your normal nutrition, with maybe a slight little bit of fatigue from the previous day, right? And you spread it out over 2 3 days. Yeah, maybe you have more noise in your data because you have day-to-day variation in there. But in average, you have a much better representative data set, which really represents how your physiology looks in training. And therefore, most
So
coaches are doing it like this.
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Do you think, Sebastian? Do you think inside will replace the metabolic cart and the laboratory testing?
Yes and no. Um, in cycling,
Explain.
in cycling, it partly did already. In cycling, it partly did already.
Yeah.
Um, Professional teams are not using metabolic cards in cycling anymore when they use Insight, um, because the Insight data is almost one-on-one the same as your metabolic card data. And the big benefit from it is that the VO2 max, for example, you get an Insight, is like everything else, like your carbohydrate combustion and fat combustion, is only related to the working muscle. And it might sound like a little like picky here, but when you go to the lab and, for example, you do a RAM test to determine VO2 max, and at the end of the RAM test, you start to you know be all over the place with your body, right? Your upper body moves left and right and up and down in all different directions. It will need
Right.
additional oxygen, but it's not contributing to power output. So you're creating a higher VO2 max without your performance going up. And this is something impossible in Insight. And therefore, most of the coaches appreciate the numbers from Insight more than they do from the lab setting, because they know when the VO2 max is higher or lower, then they know that the aerobic power output changes in the same magnitude, right? So in cycling, because of the accuracy for you have in something like VO2 max, and because of the accuracy you have in fat and carb combustion, which is another other metrics where you maybe want to use a metabolic card. Yes, we definitely see that people dumping their metabolic cards, because it's expensive and it's highly sensitive to the actual nutrition. If you want to try out, you have access to a metabolic card. Do a fat max test with having a Coke before and having a sausage before. You will see totally different numbers. Um,
That's
so it's
crazy.
very, very sensitive. It's very expensive. It's almost only possible in the lab. And so, yeah, we see that definitely, when it comes to cycling. There's an aspect on business to it. I know somebody, without saying a name here, who does inside testing, putting a VO2 analyzer on the athlete when he does the service,
Mhm.
because he says he can charge $60 extra having a VO2 analyzer on the athlete, right? Because the
Yeah,
perceived
I
value
believe
is
it.
higher. The
Mhm.
funny thing is, the thing is not even recording the data. It's just on there to justify the
Right.
higher price. Um, but that's specific to cycling. When you ask me the question when it comes to swimming or running, we use the data to very accurately determine running economy. That's, for example, why we partnered with Stanford University, because they choose Insight for their research project on running economy. That's a different story. But when it comes to cycling, additional use of VO2 data, close to zero.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. So let's talk about data hygiene, Sebastian, because with all this data of the input that were coming from the field or coming from the athlete and put it in, could you define data hygiene, what that means, and why it's so important?
Yeah, I think this is an issue, especially with cycling. That's an issue we don't have so much in swimming or running or rowing or kayaking or speed skating or I don't know what. It's something specific in cycling. Um, and what we mean with data hygiene is that, in cycling you have the phenomenon that the way how you capture your power data. So I'm talking about your power data, with your power meter. The way how you capture the scenarios in which you capture your power data are so vastly different. So you have indoors and outdoors riding, and some of the people out there will have noticed that indoors their power output is significantly lower than outdoors. And it depends on the trainers you're using, because it depends on the kinetic energy of your trainer. So very, very oversimplified saying of the flywheel mass. So, and there you go. Flywheel
Right.
mass is relatively low because if your flywheel mass of your smart trainer would be 50 kilograms, then the company producing it would have a problem distributing, shipping it. So indoors, outdoors is an issue because indoors you have much lower power output usually. Then you might have different power meters, right, on different bikes. That's an issue. Plus, on top of that, some power meters not really validated for high power outputs. Um, then you have uphill riding versus riding in the flat, which creates differences in 90% of the athletes. 90% of the athletes are able to produce significant higher power numbers riding on the climb. And then on top of that, you have riding in the saddle and out of the saddle, which is an absolutely blind spot when it comes to power meter data, because unfortunately, most of the power meters can't record or don't record if you're riding in the saddle, out of the saddle. And if you think about riding out of the saddle, you use the biomechanics change using a greater muscle mass because you use your upper body. So for us, physiologically speaking, a lot of things are changing. And this is basically where we go with data hygiene. So what you should not do, you should not make an assessment like with Insight or any other assessment, doesn't really matter at that point, mixing up those data, right? So you should not have your 20-second effort riding on the flat out of the saddle and your 3-minute effort riding on a climb partly out of the saddle, so to speak, and then your 6 and 10 minute efforts riding indoors on the rollers. That is that's what we mean with data hygiene, right? Because you're mixing
It's
it,
bad
yeah,
hygiene. Bad
you're
hygiene.
mixing it up. And this no offense, this is actually for me personally, uh, something that is greatly overlooked or ignored or not thought about or forgotten when you just create a power duration curve in Golden Cheetah, WKO, whatsoever, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing the products here. The product is great, right? The problem is what
Right.
data are you putting in. So when the data that you put in is, comes from all different data sources under all different scenarios, then the outcome represents this. And it might sound stupid, but think about you would do a test in cross country skiing, and you would say, you know what, in the testing you can use your arm and your legs, but in training you can only use your legs, or vice versa, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So what I'm saying is, when you want to use your data, for example, mostly for riding in the flat, outdoors, and riding seated, then this is how you should test, or this is how you need to test, right? Because again,
Yeah.
your power output uphill or power output out of the saddle is higher. And I get this question all the time, like from professional teams, for professional athletes, World Tour riders. They ask us, why am I not allowed to go out of the saddle when I do the lactate testing with Insight or the power testing with Insight? And the answer is, well, you know what? In the case more than 50% of your training is done out of the saddle, you should test out of the saddle. But if
Hmm.
more 50% of your training is in the saddle, then you're not allowed to go out of the saddle. Very straightforward.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. So back to our field testing analogy for the cyclist, 20-second, 3 minute, 6 minute, 12 minute, all of that seated
Yes.
outside,
Yes. All of that
match
seated.
separate. Got it.
All of that seated. And if you have been whatever in the past weeks in a lockdown and you train mostly indoors, then it's fine to do it all
Hmm.
indoors. And I mean, even if you want to test indoors and use it outdoors, then it's whatever 3-5% different. Um, that's not great, but that's something you can account for, right? The
Hmm.
most unknown and the most difficult thing is especially the thing riding out of the saddle. Because, even in a live, even when you are on site with your athlete and you know, you'd have your athlete doing 3 minutes all out, how much you know about after the 3 minutes, how much time of the 3 minutes have been out of the saddle. You have no clue, right? So you cannot even account
Right.
for that. It's an absolutely blind spot. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it's fine, right? If you want to use your training data based on that, because that's what it is, that's cool, right? And then on top of that, if you talk about some FTP stuff in whatever software package, then it's always looking at the last 30 days or something. However, it is known that training adaptations can occur obviously within 30 days. So that's another issue there when you talk about FTP from just powderation of your past 30 days, right? Um,
Yeah.
so that's one thing. So you can do with that data hygiene whatever you want. That's what I'm trying to say, right? You can use whatever software and do it, but when you want to have a real assessment and people are holding Insight accountable for the accuracy, then this is why we are so precise or picky, so to speak, on the data hygiene and how you capture the data.
Yeah. And you're trying to minimize as many variables as possible in order to get the
Sure,
best
sure,
result possible. Yeah. Yeah. Makes complete sense.
as you would do in a lab
Um,
setting. Because look,
as, yeah.
for most people, Insight is a substitute for going into the lab. And the only
Right.
reason why it is, I mean, look at it. Like, I don't know. I actually really don't know. I think Golden Cheetah also calculates the VO2 max. I know WKO does. But
Hmm.
for no professional coach is a substitute for going into the lab, right? I know like dozens of professional coaches who use WKO and it provides you with VO2 max, or your Polar Watch provides you with VO2 max, but they don't trust it enough. They still go into the lab and have it tested. Now, the difference with
Hmm.
Insight is it's a full substitute for going into the lab for those coaches. And it only can be because it is as accurate as a lab. So if we would accept any kind of data source to go into that, we would just falsify this thing, right? So it would not work anymore.
Sure. Sure. So, say Jane Doe is listening to this podcast and her coach works with or is brought up to speed on Inside, and she wants to do the coaching or she wants to go and find somebody. How often should an athlete be testing using the Inside software?
Well, I could give you the marketing answer, right? Because our business model is based on the number of assessments you run. So the marketing
Okay,
answer
so
would
every
every
day,
day, twice a day, three times a day,
twice a day.
three times a day.
Got
No, look,
it.
look. I would say an average people test 3 to 4 times a year.
Yeah.
But I, I think that's still too simple of an answer. The question is really what are you targeting? Like, so normally how it should work is, or how it should be done is, you do an initial testing because you really want to understand what's under the hood, right? You want to
Hmm.
dissect the performance of your athlete, understand, okay, which knob can I turn, which area offers the biggest room for improvement. This is why you do initially an inside test, right? And then the question when you retest, and therefore the question how often you want to retest, depends on what are you targeting in training. So for example, you're targeting VLA max, you're targeting your glycolytic power, right? Lowering VLA max means less lactate production, means higher FTP power, higher fat combustion, lower carbohydrate combustion. If you want to target that, for example, by changing your diet, changing to more like a fat adapted ketogenic diet, um, you will see the first adaptations after approximately 2 to 3 weeks. Okay. So in this
Hmm.
scenario, you might want to retest already after 2 to 3 weeks, right? To see if you are on the right track, right? To see if all the energy and time and maybe also money you invest in changing your diet pays off, right? Or is effective. Um, Other example, let's say you want to target on improving your VO2 max, okay? Um, you will see the first adaptation in VO2 max after approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Really more solid adaptation
Right.
after 10 weeks. So then you maybe only want to test after 2.5 to 3 months, right? If you want to
Yep.
bring down or let's say you want to bring up your VLA max because you want to improve your ability to attack and to sprint, right? Um, Not from a diet point of view, but really a structural adaptation, it can take several months, right? It can take up to 3, 4, 5,
Hmm.
6 months or even longer. Like, it's an ongoing process. So it doesn't make any sense to test earlier than minimum 3 months. So it depends, so to speak, right? In average,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it goes
3 to 5 times a year, but it depends on what you're targeting.
right, and it goes back, I think, to your answer to who uses and who uses and has the licensing to this thing. It's informed, educated coaches and physiologists that know not only how to do the test, but also why to do the test,
Right. Right.
right? Even though the athlete might want to test every single day, probably,
Well, and
I probably
then
have athletes that would love to do it.
maybe,
Right?
maybe, and then look, there's then this other aspect to it, which I just want to bring back when it comes to the protocol, as I said. Um, so how people are using it also, how you could use it. Let's say you make a full assessment, right? The 3, 6, 10 minute, 12 minutes, whatsoever. You make a full assessment and you start training and you want to recheck.
Mhm.
What you can do now, what the technology allows you to do, you just do the 20 minutes, you just do the 3 minutes, and then you manually enter your FTP from Golden Sheet or WKO or whatsoever, or just guess it or whatsoever, right? And
Mhm.
trigger the FTP, trigger the PPD, trigger the analyzers, and then you can have a trend, you can have an idea, right? It's maybe not the most accurate analyzers because you used an FTP with not great data hygiene, or you just guessed it or whatsoever, right? But you have a
Mhm.
trend, you have an idea, right? And then you can say, okay, you know what? I think we are up to something here. I think we see some adaptation. Let's go back tomorrow or the day after and complete the full test. You know what I'm saying? And then have a
Yep.
really accurate
Yep.
picture. So what I'm saying here is you don't even need to go as far as saying, oh, I need a higher resolution in terms of my monitoring, right? I need a more frequently testing. How coaches are using it, that's the same as lactate testing and swimming or whatsoever. You know, as a follow up, not even do the full protocol, just do a part of it, see if the data compares or if something changes. And if you have an indication for, okay, something happened or nothing happened, but I expect it to happen, then you can still do a full and highly precise testing protocol. Um, I think that's a very efficient and smart way how people are using it actually.
Yeah, no, that I like that a lot. And I guess I want to maybe even zoom back out and say, the application to train racing for the inside software. I mean, there's so much available through this software, to all different kinds of athletes. And I'll ask you to just touch on high level with this, because without slides and without a kind of webinar type of presentation, it'd be really hard to understand some of this stuff. But could you talk about like the athlete fingerprint, what why that helps to uh, help the athlete learn more about themselves, the coach learn about the athlete, the metabolic capacities as well as the load characteristics?
Yeah, so okay, so we do have load characteristics, which is basically
Mhm.
looking at different metabolic metrics in steady state conditions as a function of power output. So let me explain what this means. That means that you can see in the software, for example, your carbohydrate combustion curve as a function of power output saying at different power outputs, right? So you can see
Right.
in my base
So
train,
how much carbohydrate I am using while I'm doing a certain output?
right? In
Yep.
terms of like say grams per hour, right? So I can now
Yep.
understand how much should I fuel, okay, for a specific ride, or how much can I avoid fueling, right? Thinking about I
Mhm.
maybe want to reduce body fat, so I want to have a negative energy balance here between how much energy I take in via food and how much I burn. Um, so this is, for example, how you use it, right? So that's just one example. Um, Carbohydrate combustion. Let's say whatever. Give you an example. Your long, slow distance, your base, whatever you want to call that, intensity is at a carbohydrate combustion of 70 grams per hour. That's relatively high, right?
Mhm. I was gonna say that's kind of high,
It,
but sure,
yeah,
let's roll with
it's
it.
kind of high, right? So the question
Sure.
is, do you want to ride there? Is that the right training zone? And this is maybe bringing us back to the problem if you just base your training on something as simple as an FTP value only, and you just take whatever, I don't care, 60, 70, 80% of your FTP, it doesn't matter whatsoever, as your base training intensity, you don't know how much carbohydrate you burn at that intensity, right? And
Mhm.
so this is something you find in Insight. So let's go back to that example. Let's say you burn 70 grams of carbohydrate. And let's say you don't really are accustomed to eat a lot in training. And you go out on a Sunday ride, 3 hours, 4 hours. So you're adding up 210, 280 grams of carbohydrate that you utilize. you maybe eat one bar and one gel or one banana or I don't know what, right? And so you may be substituting 60 or 80 grams of that. So you run on a deficit on 200 grams, right? Now,
Hmm.
maybe Monday is off, Tuesday is easy because you have to go back to work. So it doesn't really matter, right? It's actually good to have this deficit because if your goal is to lose some body fat, right, or partly be in an energy negative balance here, that's great, right? Keep going.
Hmm.
You can maybe even go a little bit higher. Go to 80 grams or 90 grams of carbohydrate utilization, right? Because Monday or
Hmm.
Tuesday are easy. But now it's coming back to the thing you come back to Switzerland, right? And maybe you want to ride every day. You want to ride every day. And
Yeah,
now,
I probably would.
right, you
Yeah.
probably would, right? And so now it doesn't work anymore. Now it doesn't work anymore um, because Monday and Tuesday is not off. Monday and Tuesday is another 3, 4 hour ride where you burn a lot of
Yeah.
carbohydrates. So then you maybe want to bring down the power output. And you maybe want to look, when you do this, you maybe want to look at your fat combustion and you want to look at, okay, how much lower do I want to get without sacrificing how much fat I combust? And this is all the information you find in Insight, right? Um,
Yep.
in terms of how to set up your training intensity, so how to fine tune and be more precise, right, with your training intensity, because what works in one scenario not necessarily working in another scenario. Another example would be, um, which we briefly touch base on, um, lactate recovery or recovery rate
Yeah.
or lactate accumulation rates, right? And this is something
Yep.
which is, most, if we resonate with most athletes down there, you often have, or as a coach, you often have an idea on, what do I want to do for an interval, whatever, 5 times 4 minutes, VO2 max intervals, and I have the idea on the power output, right? I have whatever I want to do 400 watts for 4 minutes or 300 or whatsoever. It doesn't really matter. Now, when it comes to the recovery period, like how long should my athlete recover and at what intensity should my athlete recover? That's kind of a blind spot again. And to be honest, like when you prescribe something like 5 times 4 minutes, then it's like, okay, maybe we want to do 8 minutes, maybe we want to do 4 minutes. Let's do six. It's easier to calculate because when we start every 10 minutes, right? Um,
Sure.
and this is not happening with Insight. So what is, for example, included when you do whatever kind of analyze and Insight, whatever kind of test you're doing, PPD, lactate, doesn't matter, is you get a chart which is showing you the ability of the athlete to recover from an accumulation of lactate. So at what power output can the athlete recover from lactate? How quickly? So it's actually lactate combustion per minute. So it's the rate of recovery. If you want to simplify it, saying lactate, is a marker, not saying that it causes fatigue, but it's a marker for fatigue and a marker for recovery. It shows you how quickly you can recover at which power output. And that's not only something for training. Initially, when we started this, you asked me about the background. That's something that we used in Highroad HTC, for example, to determine the fitness level or the race readiness of our athletes. How quick and at which power output can you recover? Because that's not only important in training, that's especially important in racing. When you have a circuit race and you need to accelerate, or there's a climb in there and you need to push hard over the climb, riding above your threshold, or you need to follow an attack. It's not like that after that hard effort, you can raise your hand and say, hey guys, please go a little bit slower. I need to recover here. That's not happening, right? So the ability
Right.
to recover fast and at a high power output is actually maybe more important to your race performance than your FTP. And if you are
Yep.
out there and listening to that and you do circuit races, you do criteriums or whatsoever, you will know from your power output that there is nothing like an FDP in terms of there's nothing like a maximum lactate steady state. There is no steady state in a circuit race, right? It's
Yep.
only
Yep.
accumulating fatigue and recovering. And this is exactly what you see in Insight.
Very powerful. And I think with that being said, I'd say let's summarize by saying as software and analytics become more robust and portable, right? We can glean ton of insights from the athlete's engine and what you've created in inside, I believe, might just be, scratching the surface of where this all goes, of how to improve, where to improve, and why it matters, right?
Yeah, no,
Right?
that's definitely true. What you currently see is, yeah, there's much more to it. There are actually some tools and some analyzers and some technologies in there which are currently limited. um, they're only they're only available for the French Olympic Committee and Jumbo Visma and some teams. And yeah, there is much more that you can do with that when it comes to understanding race performance. We use that, for example, in time trial pacing very successfully. If you think about the track record of HGC Highroad Columbia in time trial, we used metabolic simulations, so to speak, or calculations for time trial pacing strategies. So there's much, much
Mhm.
more to it. And so, yeah, I think there's more to come and how you can use it to better understand your training. Think about carbohydrate combustions in training. So after each training session, you can understand better how much you should eat and so on. Um, so yeah, I think there's much more um, that you can expect from that.
Yeah. Yeah, a ton more. So for our audience, I mean, uh, explore more. Go to inside.com, and we'll have this in the show notes, but um, it is inscyd.com, and you can find more there. But Sebastian, before we wrap up, I've got three questions, and I call them the takeaways, and they're designed for athletes to hear from you and just kind of like quick answers from you based on your experiential knowledge. So uh, we'll do those questions and then we'll wrap.
Sure, sure.
Okay. All right. Question number one. What is the most common thing athletes or coaches change after they use your software? If you could distill it down into like one thing.
I guess that's a cycling specific question, no? Um,
Yeah, let's do it. It'll make it probably more
no,
easier to answer.
yeah. I think the most common thing is to start thinking about the background how FDP is created, and in some cases, then vastly change the approach in training how to change it. So it's a first step. It's a first adoption when using Insight is most coaches are still FDP centered. Maybe it doesn't, it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, right? Depends on what kind of racing
Yep.
the athlete is looking at. We
Right.
just
Right.
briefly indicated that. But the first step is really change the training. So you will really be able to see, does this athlete I'm looking at here will benefit more from like simplifying long, slow distance, more endurance kind of work, or will this athlete benefit more from doing some intervals or some high torque, low cadence stuff? These kind of questions. So really giving you this first broad direction on where you need to go. And this is already changing a lot. It's already changing tons in terms of the efficiency. Because to be honest, it doesn't really matter if your training zone is 200 watts or 210 watts based on whatever model for training zones. It doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't change anything.
Right.
But
Right.
knowing if you should do more intervals or more hours changes a lot. So this is the first thing that happens when you start using Insight, I say.
Got it. Cool. And question number two, and this would be a fun one. If you could change anything right now about your software, what would it be?
Making it more user friendly and more simply to understand.
Got it. Perfect. Question three, and the final one. Even if listeners never test with Inside, what would you recommend for them to do with their data or their training in order to improve?
Maybe start looking a little bit less on data and start to think about for yourself, which training do I appreciate the most? Um, and the reason why I'm saying that is twofold. One reason is um, I really believe that it's better to have no data than bad data, or
Oh,
having looking less in the data is better to looking at the data the wrong way or overthinking the data. That's one reason. And the other reason is because when you are more like a sprinter type of rider, then you will appreciate more sprint exercises. And when you're more like a climber or endurance athlete, then you will most likely appreciate those. You will enjoy. That's maybe the better word here. Enjoy those
Hmm.
exercises a little bit more. And so this tells you a lot already. Forget about insight and all this, nitty gritty, fancy, nerdy stuff here. Um, you know, it will tell you a little bit on what kind of rider you are, and therefore maybe will tell you a little bit on how to train a little bit better. Um, and therefore, I would strongly encourage you to listen and try to listen a little bit on what you enjoy and what kind of rider you are, and don't be too focused on FTP, power duration, all this kind of stuff, really, because it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter. Like, there's even in professional cycling, there's almost never ever one, like if you look at the Tour de France, there's almost never ever one single scenario where you ride at your FTP. So it's vastly oversold here, I guess.
Yeah. Go. That's powerful. That's huge and really, really good experiential advice coming from a physiological sage, like we like we stated at the
Yeah,
very
yeah,
beginning of this.
yeah.
So, Sebastian, that's it. If listeners want to follow you on the socials or get in touch with you, how does that work?
Yeah, so I'm not really good on social media actually. We do have a website as you indicated. I would like to say
Yep.
it's maybe not the greatest website. We are redoing it. So depending on when you listen to this podcast, maybe you come back.
Yep.
We're going to have an athlete-centered website
Cool.
uh, in a couple of weeks. So that's maybe good. Um, no, so one reason why you maybe want to find why you want to find our website is not only because you want to find an inside coach and not giving you the marketing pitch here, but there's actually a lot of free content and free knowledge up there. We regularly do webinars which are very, very popular, and believe it or not, we have everybody on the webinar, from athletes to head of performance to PhD in physiologists. So there's a lot of free stuff on our website: white papers, webinars, blog posts, of all different kind of stuff. So forget about the marketing pitch here. If you really want to learn more about it and learn more about how to apply physiological knowledge and physiological science to your training and racing, then this might be a reason why you want to come to the website.
Yeah, that's it. And I will attest to the information there. After doing a few webinars and poking around on articles and whatnot, it's a great informational website to go to, even if you don't utilize the testing and software. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you, Sebastian. I know it's late there, so I'll let you get to bed. And thanks for joining us on the TrainRight podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.